So we've done some very sort of generalized questions. I'd like to move into a few more specific questions, and starting with the divide just sort of between masculinity and femininity. And part of the reason I bring that up is because, Devi, you are a scholar on Indigenous masculinities, but also the lived experience of a Black man can be a very different lived experience than a Black woman, and for a trans person or a non-binary person. But I was wondering if, Devi, if you could start about sort of sharing your own experience as a Black man and then relate that to some of the research you do into Black masculinities or Indigenous masculinities.
Yeah, thanks. You know, I think for me, coming to the term of masculinity, it's a very personal kind of journey. And so first of all, I have to sort of like prefix, I was laughing because I just were talking about some of the work that I've been writing about, and I got some feedback from some of my communities, and they were like, you know, I really, you know, wanted to read some of the stuff you're doing, but it's got a lot of heavy words and a lot of jargon in it, and so that you know, I'm kind of thinking about that and thinking about, you know, kind of some of that struggle, and I think sometimes we hide behind those words because it's really is painful. And at the same time, we're trying to capture these really complicated experiences and trying to sort of give words to them, right? Because sometimes they're experiences, and we're trying to find ways to explain them and trying to sort of like put them within the context, of course. But also the context that you speak also then creates a whole accessibility issue. And then full casting that really to sort of get to that. When I started going to school, when I started really engaging very deeply with these things, is I was struggling with the sense of how I'd seen how colonialism had fragmented myself from my family, and how I felt extremely disadvantaged, right, by colonial oppression and racism. And so that anger, I was telling a particular story. And in telling that story, I started realizing that in reference to my own mother and how my own family had been been fragmented by colonialism, I had a very specific target, and that I saw my mother has been the target of my anger, right? And of saying, how could you let me, how could you leave me? How could you let me end up in an orphanage on the streets? And so there was a targeting very clearly of my mother of this, right? And part of that is about the kind of lateral violence we start to perpetuate against each other, because, you know, the systemic racism that is both within the education, within the politics, is so overwhelming that we can't even face it directly. And so we start spreading, you know, and targeting the very people who we can, and so for me, it was women, and very particularly it was our own Black women, and I saw white women as folks that I could use to elevate myself into the colonial structure, right? And so part of that was recognizing that I was both being rejected by the colonial system and also being accepted at the same time, right? So my Blackness was a useless marker within the colonial paradigm, but yet my maleness can be, you know, sort of like galvanized and utilized in ways that could call me into participating in very marginal ways. It still reminded me that I was not part of the system, but could allow me to then exploit other folks. So I could be racist, and I could be homophobic, I could be, you know, transphobic, I could be, you know, exercise patriarchy and misogyny, because the structure gave me somewhat of an acceptance within that, right? And so part of that was recognizing and trying to see that. And I don't claim that I recognize this by myself. It's really through, you know, works like Audre Lorde, butchering sister's name, Audre Lorde's work, folks like Bell Hooks, Kimberly Crankshaw, and, you know, and other Indigenous scholars, and that seeing and starting to hear some of these stories, and somebody very strong and very dear to me who passed away quite well, some time now, but I was thinking of Yvonne Vera's work, who was writing about the African experience, specifically about women's experience, had a profound impact on me in terms that she opens up in Ibachimachi's work on the joys of motherhood. Both of them open up by really saying, you know, we've been marked, right? We've been marked to be exploited by the colonial system and to be exploited by our own men, right? And that all we are here is to serve their whims. And it was in one of those moments where I thought, where does my mother fit into all of this, right? And asking that question was like opening up a can of worms, right? Because it got me time to really look at things and to hear, how did I know my mother? Well, I knew my mother through an absence. And in that absence, I had a particular narrative that was fed to me by my father, who could not, you know, who again wasn't having a tough time facing the realities of the colonial structure, and so was dissipating some of his anger, some of his resentment towards my mother. And so my notion of understanding her was mediated through that. And so I came up with these very patriarchal, very masculine, toxic notions of how do women and queer folks materialize in my life. And so really, and I'm sharing that because I'm saying that really my work has been about unlearning, right, those binaries, unlearning those identities, unlearning, you know, how I see myself and how I understand myself. And, you know, and I want to, you know, acknowledge that I've been mothered, you know, nurtured, other mothered by many, many amazing sisters, mothers, aunties, across many nations, across many ethnic African identities. And I'm super grateful. And that has allowed me to start reflecting and start thinking about how, as men, how do we show up, right? How do we start to offer nurturing that is not predicated on toxic power or colonial power, that is different, right? And some of the work I do is with some of our communities, which have been teaching me that you can't be whole if you don't understand both your masculine identity and your feminine identity, and that I hold both those in me, and that colonialism has made me suppress one in order to exist in a particular context. Sorry.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's super interesting. I could listen to you go on to that for a lot longer, but maybe John, you could pick up on that as the other sort of man in the conversation, and also the intersectionality, because you identify as a member of the LGBT community. If you could talk about your lived experience as a Black man as well as a gay man.
Right. Well, I think I was actually thinking about this question quite a bit over the last couple of days, and I guess the thing that I'd like to focus on is the comparative experience. And I know it's not always appropriate to directly compare experiences as amongst minorities, because I don't think it's necessarily fair to compare the struggles. The struggles are different. They're both very worthwhile. They're both very important, and they're both very meaningful to me. But one of the things that I've noticed is, again, I mentioned earlier, I'm kind of in my mid-30s now, so I've had a chance for almost half my life being an adult to kind of see the evolution of things. And one thing that I've seen over the last number of years is the quickness with which the LGBT or sensitivity towards those issues have quickly been adopted socially. Right, it's something that, and I work in corporate Canada. Right, I'm a corporate lawyer. I've seen the quickness with which corporate Canada, businesses, Canadian society in general has sought to embrace, at least on a superficial level, but nevertheless embrace the cause of equality for LGBT Canadians, which is you know, it's a nice thing to see. I'd like to see more concrete actions, particularly as it pertains to people who might even within the LGBT community be marginalized, including racialized people who are LGBT, including especially trans people. I think that's something that's an issue that I don't think we spend enough time really reflecting on and really engaging with as a corporate culture, as a corporate society in corporate Canada. And I compare that to corporate Canada and Canadian society's general embrace of, let's talk about Black Lives Matter, right? Black Lives Matter has been a struggle, even though the name has been Black Lives Matter for the last, I don't know, 5-6 years. It's been a struggle that's been existing for decades, centuries. There have been civil rights movements in Canada, the United States, all of the Americas, all over the world for years. We've had the same kind of pressures, the same kind of protests, the same kind of issues with respect to violence, with respect to everything else. But for whatever reason, okay, the embrace of the cause has been so much slower to come. And that's one thing that I find particularly notable. It makes me uncomfortable, right? When you think about it, when you think, okay, wait a minute, there's this part of me that the people around the table would have rejected 20 years ago, but now they embrace. They love the fact that I'm there. They think it's important. They've got that pride flag in the month of June and in Montreal in the month of August to demonstrate, to show everybody how proud they are that I'm there. And I'm very touched by that. But then there's that other element where it's like, even to get anyone in corporate Canada to say Black Lives Matter, to put out a statement publicly to say, this is important to all of us, we stand with you. It's been so much harder to come by. And that I find particularly frustrating, right? Because it's to me, to go back to something we heard a bit earlier from, I forget which of the other panelists mentioned it, but regardless of what we're talking about here, we're talking about humanity. It's about making sure as part of this entire discussion that we recognize our value respectively as human beings, right? And so if we start to recognize everybody as human beings and recognize that everybody matters, then you have to also recognize that the particular struggles that we face as Black people are things that need to be emphasized, and from not just from the struggle perspective, because I think we focus a lot on struggle, but also from the perspective of embracing us as a culture, as a people, as fully participating members of our society, including amongst corporate Canadian societies as well. Like you've got to have that too, and I find it very frustrating sometimes to see the pace of change in that respect.
Let's move over to the other gendered side, if you believe in two genders, and let's talk about some of the lived and perceived experiences of a Black woman. And so, Towela, let's start with you. What has been your experience like as a Black woman in Winnipeg, as a Black woman who still identifies with her African culture?
Ooh, so Devi really got me when you were speaking about your kids and having to explain to them that you could be tokenized and like borderline worshipped one moment and then used and like borderline abused the next, which is something that currently living through and trying to navigate. Like it's been hard. Like I think I really started thinking about race when David and I were in Ecuador, Justin's partner, when we were doing our training, and I was having a conversation with one of the other trainees, two of them, one from Montreal, one from Ontario, and the Ontarian was the one kind of asking me like, racism, like in Canada, like, no, give me an example, right? And then the man from Montreal was more, yeah, no, like I've seen it, I've kind of experienced it, I've witnessed it, and he's had more time, he spent more time in America too, so it was easier for him to get the parallel. But my lived experience, it hasn't been easy. I think learning a new vocabulary, really being able to sit and absorb and kind of process what I've gone through has really helped me stay sane. Having a counselor, Ida Stradkowski, and she's really helped me manage and go through a lot. yeah, I think the hardest thing right now is earning that paycheck and having to really navigate and tiptoe really carefully without, I feel as though if I was to be my full self, for lack of better explanation, then I wouldn't be able to earn an income, which is like, it's really, really, really hard. And that's where, yeah, I feel like I'm being tokenized, and to a certain point until I start making people uncomfortable. I start asking you those questions and looking you in the eye, right? And then I'm asked to sit down and be quiet and really risk losing my income and my livelihood. And so, yeah, it hasn't been easy. I feel like I'm kind of rambling. Is there a question? Maybe I can better.
Sure. I mean, have you experienced particular microaggressions in your experience, or even overt racism in your lived experience in Winnipeg? Because we know Winnipeg is a multicultural place, but the incarceration rates for Indigenous and Black people in Winnipeg are much higher than in other jurisdictions. We know that there is overt racism, there's overt poverty in Winnipeg, and it's often minority communities who feel the brunt of that. So if you feel comfortable sharing something, I mean, you don't, by any means, you don't have to, but if there's something that you feel has really impacted you that you'd like to share, then I open that to you.
Oh, Justin, you know I'm a talker. So I mentioned my friend Nampandi before. She has this page. It's called It Happens in Winnipeg. And yeah, so she's been getting a lot of emails, just a lot of stories about racial things happening in Winnipeg, which that narrative of we're Canada, we're peaceful, kind of like that racial utopia, which really truly doesn't exist. But for me, myself, and coming back to learning a new vocabulary and really being able to sit and process things, some microaggressions faced at work where before I was in a position without as much power. So I was volunteering before. And so walking away from conversations feeling really gross, and just feeling like hair standing up, eyebrow raised, but not really being able to know what I was feeling and why I was feeling it. And then now learning that vocabulary and being able to process things, but also being in the same job-ish, being in the same place, in the same workplace, but having more power. Now I'm able to actually look you in the eye and tell you what you did, why it felt a certain way. And so for me, I think it's just, I've stopped caring. Like I've really let go of that. Ooh, like what if I lose my job? What if I can't earn an income? I know that my community has my back because of things like my friend's page, like It Happens in Winnipeg. We have Sister Circle in Winnipeg now, a group of Black women. We get together, we all support each other, we support each other's businesses. And so I don't feel that colonial pressure. Like I know I will be okay without the white man's dollar, which, which it takes a huge weight off, but it also gives me that liberty to truly be myself and to celebrate being Malawian, to celebrate being a female. I know! I heard you mention it earlier. So it's, yeah, Winnipeg, I feel like even more than the big cities, even more than the big cities like Toronto and Montreal, is really looked at as a racial utopia, and having the biggest Filipino population, just things like that, which really make Canada multicultural, right? Like we got the first Jollibee in Winnipeg because we have the biggest Filipino population, but really like you look at the Filipino population and how they're living, there's 10 people, 12 people, 15 people living in one house because of the economic difficulties that they face. And so there's just so much. It's messy here, and it's harder to clean up because people don't want to acknowledge the mess, because we're supposed to be that racial utopia, and Winnipeg's supposed to be more multicultural and diverse, but also having my own friends. Do you have time for a quick story?
Let's do it.
there was a man who ripped off his shirt and started beating on his chest for absolutely no reason. I made a comment for absolutely no reason also, right? This escalated things, and I had to call my brother. My brother and his friends came within minutes. It was glorious. It really, really saved me. But from that altercation, the police were called, and the man who took off his shirt and started beating his chest was a white man. My brother and his Black friends came, so they were the ones who got really, really treated poorly. This is also one of my first time really, really witnessing police brutality just right in front of my face. My brother and my brothers, they got put in handcuffs and taken to a different location. We followed them, but I remember seeing my brother in handcuffs with his face down, and me stopping and asking the officer to please release my brother. He was only standing there. He was only there to defend me and trying to explain the story and stuff like that. And him looking me dead in the eyes. And I've never seen such hatred or anything like that. And that's, I think, the first time I was like, wow, like we are living, I'm sure, Asiyah, you mentioned your defining moment of, wow, this is just like a country like anything else. I think that was me, like, because I made a comment, my brother was in handcuffs, and like all, like everything really, really playing out. And so Winnipeg, I love it because once it warms up, it's easier for us to get together. We have a lot of festivals, Folklorama, which truly, truly celebrates so many different cultures and so many different countries. I've been a part of the African Pavilion since I could walk. So really, really grateful for things like that. But then there's the cold, which is really, really frigid, which could also be carried in people's hearts. So it's interesting. It's as good as it is bad living in Winnipeg.
Thank you. And thank you for sharing that story, because I think that, I would like to discuss, if we have time, some of the police brutality for sure.
Can I just jump in? Sister, do you speak Sarah? I'm like, come on now. Onyanja?
Yeah, I can speak Chichewa. Yeah. We know Kwambiri, Ziko. Masi.
I bring people together from all over, making connections.
Those are mine.
No, thank you. And Towela too, I want to come back to the idea also of tokenism, and I want to don't let me not touch on that again. But Asiyah, your experience as a Black woman, and also your intersectionality with identifying as a Muslim Black woman, if you could also speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. I first want to acknowledge this connection that was just made. It was just beautiful to witness. And I really want to thank all of the panelists for their vulnerability, I think, in touching on these questions, because I think it touches a lot on our individual identities and how that manifests, and therefore how the external world engages with that. So I really want to honor everyone's vulnerability with that. When it comes to this question, I was also pondering it for a little while, because sometimes even the words that were used, you talked about has Canada been a place for tolerance and acceptance for me as a Muslim woman? And tolerance by definition means to endure, to go through something, like to go through some form of hardship, to come over at the end of the day, to overcome something. And I feel as though in a lot of spaces I have been tolerated. I feel as though I've been tolerated more than accepted and exploited, where that tokenism part comes in more than appreciated. And what I mean by that is that as a person, and especially when I was a student at the University of Victoria, I'm Black, I'm a woman, I'm Muslim, I was an international student, English was my first language. I was kind of very, I guess, diverse in a lot of the experiences or works that I had experience on, and therefore I was this cacophony of just multiple identities. And so when I was asked to speak, I was asked to sit, at first, I was very grateful. I was very thankful for the opportunity to be in those circles, to be in the realms, to join people at certain tables. But it wasn't until my third year in Victoria that I recognized a lot of the time I was there to be representative for their definition of EDI and acceptance. I was there to be seen and not heard. And if I was to be heard, like in similar ways that Devi was mentioning, I was used to be exploited. My voice was used to be exploited to represent an identity that was used to invalidate other identities, other experiences, and people of the intersections that I represent. So it's been very, very interesting being a Muslim woman here. I remember being very excited even coming to Canada, because I'm from a non-Muslim majority country. I'm from the Bahamas, which is a Christian majority country. And so when I think about my island, for a very long while, it's literally my mother, my father, my brothers, and myself who were practicing Muslims on the island. And therefore just my mother and myself who were visibly Muslim. And so when it came to my experiences in schools, I'd constantly be asked, you know, why do you wear that thing on your head? And I'd have to explain from people from kindergarten all the way up to teachers. And I honor that experience because it's what made me prepared to be able to explain my Islam, explain my spirituality in these spaces. Because a lot of times the question doesn't come the same way. It's a lot more confrontational, but it's the same question. It's just, you know, it's manifested in another avenue. And I find a lot of people who are from Muslim majority countries have never had to explain or defend their identity. And so that is a mantle that I take up quite a lot. And in Canada, I can say in Victoria that one moment that Towela kind of reintroduced, that one moment that really just sparked me out of Canada being this bubble place was in my second year of university, and it was on a bus, you know, a public bus, and I was sitting in the back of that bus, and this guy was sitting on the side of me, and he just took it upon himself to stand up and just, I mean, curse me stink. I mean, like hurls about I should go away, I should kill myself, why am I here, I should go back to my country, why am I existing in space? And I mean, just like profanities. And it was weird for me because I also, at that time, I had never been confronted in that way. And I also was on a public bus and I wasn't the only person there. And when he ended up leaving that bus after literally 5 to 7 minutes of being this close to me and just abusive. And he ended up leaving, and I remember getting off at the next stop and I just bawled my eyes out. And I remember some of the first questions that I was asking myself was, did I do anything wrong? What kind of prompted or provoked that reaction within him? And what also hurt was A, that no one stood up for me in that bus, but B, I also didn't know which identities he was attacking. I didn't know if it was because I was Black. I didn't know if it was because I was Muslim. I didn't know if it was a combination of both. And it's this idea that being of all these different identities, it's when you don't know, it genuinely just leaves me at a loss. And even today, it's still been one of those instances where it's, I wish I spoke up, but it's also, why didn't anyone else? And it's that idea you were talking about allyship and the bystander. And do I think it's because everyone in that bus agreed? No, but do I think it's because they always thought someone else would say something or someone else would do something about it? I do. And is it comfortable intervening in those instances? No. But when it comes to experiences as a Muslim woman in Canada, since then I've become a lot more in tune to the looks that I've been getting and the way that people approach me or don't approach me in certain sentences, in certain circumstances. And I still sometimes to this day don't know, are you nervous because I'm Muslim? Are you nervous because I'm Black? Are you nervous because of those intersecting identities? Because I don't think it's because I'm a woman. I was like, I feel like I can check that one off the list, but it's like, what has prompted these reactions within you? And one of the first times I spoke very, very publicly about my Islamic identity was in remembrance to the Quebec shooting that happened in 2017, the mosque shooting. And I remember that once, I think these little awarenesses come up a lot. I think there's like a little veil that opens for everybody, and it takes a lot of work to keep that open, but I think constantly within our experiences, we all have those instances that kind of open that veil a little bit more, open it a little bit more, clear our eyes a little bit more, make us recognize kind of where we are and our identities, our intersectionalities, and everything that comes with being an individual within our bodies. And that shooting in the mosque was one of them for me, because that was another day of just being like, wow, this is where I'm living. And then again, in 2019, when Bill 21 was passed, the law against religious freedoms. And it shocked me, not only because it happened, but also because of the conversations that it spurred within people around me who were like, you know, I kind of agree with it. You should be celebrating your spirituality within your home away, like, don't let it be seen. come outside and be just like everybody else. And it just made me think about, you know, I don't know why, but it gave me this parallel of like breastfeeding and mothers, and this idea that we're hiding something that's so natural. And I think when it comes to Black peoples, our spirituality is innate within us. And I won't say that therefore everyone is indoctrinated or follows a specific thing, but I think we all have maybe something that drives us. And I think that spirituality is so core to who we are. And so when I think about my experiences as a Muslim woman in Canada, it's honestly been shocking. But then it also just, I think, moves me because when it comes to this movement, when it comes to this revolution, I don't think it can be succeeded without some form of spiritual guide. I don't think that it can be pushed for. I don't think we can win without being guided by something that is more than us. It's something that is above us, something that's not individual or selfish, but something that's literally for another and with a higher purpose. Because I think as humans, we do fall into this trap of being so self, so I. And that in and of itself is something that's, I think, taught through colonialism. Because when we think about our communities, we never lived isolated. We never lived on our own. We've always been of one ummah. We've always been one community. We've always depended on each other. And so that connection has always been so strong. And so I think no matter what it is, there's so much that can be learned from these teachings. And so you partly asked me, like, what do I suggest to bring changes when these microaggressions or things happen? How do those changes take place? And I think a lot of that has to be willing to talk about it. In our spaces as well, something that's happening within our local masjid is trying to make sure that our spaces are inclusive to all. So when we think about, I think the one thing that people really think about is like our 2S LGBTQ plus community, and how that sometimes comes in conflict when it comes to spirituality or faith, but the recognition that that is just another identity, and therefore that is also welcomed within these spiritual places, within these spiritual practices. And so those are the conversations I think that need to be had. And it's so not just having a conversation, but setting the intention to learn, the intention to understand, the intention to be guided, the intention to listen, and the intention to accept. Because if not, people who are Muslim, people who are Sikh, Hindus, spiritual, anyone will always be balancing that line between tolerance and violence. Yeah, thank you.
That's, yeah, so great. Thank you so much for all of you for sharing your personal experiences. And